Well, hello, and it's our final lesson on cellular respiration, and this is called fermentation. Fermentation is what happens when you don't have oxygen. There's organisms that don't require oxygen, so let's see what happens. How do they get their energy? Our goal is to connect the role of ATP to energy transfers within the cell. Our objectives are to explain how organisms get energy in the absence of oxygen, and also identify the pathway the body uses to release energy during exercise. All right, we use oxygen to release chemical energy from the food we eat, but what if oxygen is not around? Is there a way that allows cells to extract energy from food in the absence of oxygen? So organisms that don't need free oxygen to survive are called anaerobic. Some types of bacteria and other single-celled organisms like microbes can live without oxygen, but nothing very complex has been found until the year 2010. There were 3 species of what we call Loricifera, which have been discovered in the oxygen-free water in the deepest parts of the ocean. Here's a picture of one, and this is why they're more complex organisms, because they have a rectum, and they have an esophagus, they even have ovums, and they have a mouth, all that stuff, all right? But they were discovered in the deepest parts of the oceans. The evolutionary history of these creatures is not yet known, but they live in an environment which was a reminiscence of the Earth's ocean some 600 million years ago, before the deep seas were even oxygenated and large animals had evolved. That's a little interesting information. So how did that happen? So fermentation is objective 1, explain how organisms get energy in the absence of oxygen. All right, so what is fermentation? Fermentation is what cells do when there's not enough oxygen. When there's a lack of oxygen, cells need to do something with those pyruvates, but they cannot perform the Krebs cycle or the electron transport chain because those are both aerobic processes. So cells perform fermentation, and different cells do fermentation differently. 2 different ways we're going to discuss today is alcohol fermentation and lactic acid fermentation. Let me give you a broad overview of alcohol fermentation. This is the process which, for example, yeast use. When there is a lack of oxygen, the cell starts to produce CO2 and alcohol as waste. This is the reason why yeast is used in baking. Bread, for example, won't rise without yeast, but it does rise because yeast creates CO2, which makes it rise, little bubbles in there. The smell you get from baking is when the alcohol burning off. The reason we do not get intoxicated when eating bread, because the alcohol that is made from the fermentation, is because the alcohol has been burned off during the baking process of high temperatures. The other type of fermentation you're going to learn is the lactic acid fermentation. And this is done by most animal cells. In the absence of oxygen, animal cells produce lactic acid to create more NAD+. This is only temporary though, and if it is anaerobic for longer, the cells will not be able to produce ATP. With the lack of ATP, the cells will die. That is why lactic acid fermentation is the last resort and can only be done for a short amount of time. Okay, so fermentation does produce 2 AT molecules for every molecule of glucose, just like we had in glycolysis. It is also anaerobic, meaning that there's no oxygen being used. Instead, electrons taken from glucose reduce NAD+ to NADH, which then adds the electrons back to the pyruvate. This is the process of fermentation. This can either form lactic acid or through a secondary intermediary ethyl alcohol. It is quite inefficient as compared to aerobic respiration, which can produce up to 38 molecules of ATP and only releases CO2 and water. So let's look at it a little more closely, step by step. Again, fermentation is a process by which energy can be released from food molecules in the absence of oxygen. And it also occurs in the cytoplasm of cells. So under anaerobic conditions, fermentation follows glycolysis. All right? During fermentation, cells convert NADH produced by glycolysis back into NAD+, which allows glycolysis to continue producing ATP. Yeast and a few other microorganisms use alcoholic fermentation. This is alcoholic fermentation on this side. That produces ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a waste in ethyl alcohol. This process is used to produce alcoholic beverages and causes the bread dough to rise like we discussed before. And this is the chemical equation. You get the pyruvic acid from the glycolysis plus some NADH. You're going to get your alcohol, your CO2, and a NAD+. Some organisms use this. Most organisms, including humans, carry out fermentation using a chemical reaction that converts pyruvic acid to lactic acid. So your pyruvic acid plus NADH gives you lactic acid plus some more NAD+. That can go back to the cycle again. The NAD+ cycles back on both sides. In this case, we get lactic acid. In that case, you get your alcohol. All right. So here is another slide showing the processes in a little more details. Again, you get your alcohol on this side, and you get your lactic acid. And this happens in your muscles, and this happens with yeast or other microbes like that. You can take a look at that, but I don't want to take too much time. All right. So objective 1 was explain how organisms get energy in the absence of oxygen. In the absence of oxygen, fermentation releases energy from food molecules by producing ATP. There's another chart for it there too. All right. Objective 2 is identify the pathways the body uses to release energy during exercise. So, cells normally contain small amounts of ATP produced during cellular respiration, enough for a few seconds of intense activity. Lactic acid fermentation can supply enough ATP to last about 90 seconds, which means you don't need any oxygen for about 90 seconds. As you know, if you hold your breath that long, extra oxygen is going to be required to get rid of the lactic acid produced. Right? So like following intense exercise, a person will huff and puff for several minutes in order to pay back that build-up oxygen debt and clear the lactic acid from the body naturally. All right. For intense exercise lasting longer than 90 seconds, cellular respiration is required to continue production of ATP. Cellular respiration releases energy more slowly than fermentation does. The body stores energy in the form of carbohydrate glycogen. These glycogen stores are enough to last for 15 to 20 minutes of activity. After that, the body begins to break down other stored molecules, including fats. That's when you burn the fat for energy. And then after that, you're going to start using those proteins, which we don't want to get to. Hibernating animals like this brown bear you see right here, he's cute, he's sleeping, rely on stored fat for energy when they sleep through the winter too. All right, so objective 2 was to identify the pathways the body uses to release energy during exercise. So for a short, quick burst of energy, the body uses ATP that's already in the muscles, as well as ATP made by lactic acid fermentation. For exercise longer than about 90 seconds, cellular respiration is the only way to continue generating a supply of ATP. Gotta breathe, people. Breathe through. And there's another puppy picture. Bye. On to chapter 10.